Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Carol and her silly voices.
Alright, ladies and gentlemen, it's me, Carol. He said, welcome to the stage, Carol. Here I am, it's Carol. It'd be weird if someone other than Carol had come out. I'm Carol, I've been welcomed to the stage. It's me, Carol, and I do silly voices. You see, that's the thing you got to understand about me, Carol, as I've been welcomed to the stage, is I do silly voices. I do silly voices, and my name's Carol. My name's Carol, and I do silly voices. To be honest, I'm a bit annoyed that you said that I do silly voices, because that's my whole thing. I'm Carol, I do silly voices, I do silly voices. My name's Carol. I'm Carol, and I do silly voices. That's my thing. I do silly voices and my name's Carol. And if you said, welcome to the stage, here's Carol, you wouldn't know that I do silly voices and I'm Carol. I could surprise you with Carol's silly voices because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. Because you said, here's Carol with her silly voices, you know you expect some silly voices from me because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. Problem with having silly voices, you've got to keep people waiting for the silly voices because I'm Carol, I do silly voices. Carol's got to keep you waiting for her silly voices because the silly voices that I do, I'm Carol, I do silly voices. I've got to make you wait for them because you can anticipate them a bit more because I'm Carol and I do silly voices and I want you to wait for my silly voices. Some people might think they're not that silly, but trust me, I'm Carol, I do silly voices. That is my thing. I know that the voices are silly because they're silly voices and I'm Carol and I do silly voices. First thing I noticed about my silly voices is they weren't that close to my own voice because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. I'm not Carol with the silly voice or with the silly voices. I'm Carol and I have silly voices. I do silly voices. They're my thing, it's my act. I'm Carol, welcome on the stage, I'm happy to be here. I'm Carol and I do silly voices. I do silly voices on the stage because I'm Carol, that's my thing, that's my act. I'm Carol and I do silly voices and I keep you waiting for my silly voices because the suspense of waiting for my silly voices. I'm Carol, that's me, I'm Carol, I do silly voices. If you want to wait for the silly voices, then that's what I want to do. I want to build some suspense, I want to keep you guessing, I want you to think, where are these silly voices coming from, when they're going to get here, because I'm Carol, I do silly voices. It's an act, it's a silly voice act. It's not just me talking, it's not my voice. This is my voice, this isn't my silly voice. I'm Carol, I do silly voices. This is just Carol's voice. Carol does silly voices. Silly voices aren't Carol. I'm Carol and I do silly voices and I've been welcomed to the stage because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. I do silly voices. You understand? I do silly voices. I do many silly voices and this is not one of them because this is my voice. I'm Carol, Carol's voice. Welcome to the stage, Carol who does silly voices. I know you're starting to think, when's she going to do these silly voices? Is she going to do any silly voices? Is this just a thing where she talks about her silly voices? Well, obviously, I'm Carol, I do silly voices, I do silly voices, my name's Carol, I do silly voices. I'm going to do the silly voices because my name's Carol and I do silly voices. I'm not just going to come up here and talk about my silly voices, I'm going to actually do my silly voices because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. Obviously, I do other things, I don't just do silly voices, but for the purposes of the act, for the acting act, I'm Carol and I do silly voices. So it's silly voices, it's a silly voice act. And I noticed you're probably starting to get a bit annoyed because I'm not doing my silly voices, but I think it's important to make you wait for my silly voices because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. And if I had silly voices and brought them out right at the start of the act, you'd be like, well, it's just silly voices. Where's Carol? I want to know more about Carol, or Carol who does the silly voices. Because I'm Carol, I'm happy to be here on the stage, where I was welcomed onto the stage with my silly voices. I'm happy to be here and do my silly voices because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. I do silly voices and I want you to know Carol before you know the silly voices, even though I am Carol and Carol does silly voices because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. I'm starting to understand maybe it's time for me to tell you about my silly voices. Maybe you want to hear my silly voices because obviously hearing a silly voice, you want to hear the silly voice, you want to actually hear the silly voice from me, Carol who does silly voices. I'm welcome on the stage, I'm happy to be on the stage. I'm Carol and I do silly voices. Silly voices, I do silly voices because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. You want to hear them, you don't want to hear about them so much. You want to hear the voices. You want to actually hear Carol doing her silly voices. You just don't want to hear from Carol and her silly voices, even if you don't hear it necessarily in one of Carol's silly voices, because I'm Carol, I may have mentioned that a couple of times. I'm Carol and I do silly voices. I do silly voices and my name's Carol. I'm Carol and I do silly voices. I'm going to tell you now. I'm going to tell you when I'm going to do my silly voice. I'm going to do my silly voice pretty soon. My first silly voice is the best one. I think you'll agree because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. So I know the difference between a good silly voice and a bad silly voice. And I'm Carol. I do silly voices. So you can trust me on my judgment when I say I do a good silly voice or a bad silly voice. I'm going to do a good silly voice for you. And I think you probably waited long enough for it. So here it is. I'm Carol. I do silly voices. I'm bringing you my first silly voice, possibly my only silly voice. I don't know. I probably only have one time for a silly voice while I'm on the stage. I'm welcome on the stage. I'm happy to be on the stage because I'm Carol and I do silly voices. That's why I'm here. I do silly voices and my name's Carol. But here it is, my first silly voice. First silly voice from Carol. Carol who does silly voices. You're going to love it because I do silly voices and my name's Carol. I'm good at silly voices because Carol does silly voices. That's what Carol does. Silly voices, you think, oh, Carol does silly voices and I'm Carol, happy to be here on the stage and I'm Carol and I do silly voices. And here it is, my silly voice. I'm very happy to bring it to you, very happy to be here. I'm Carol and I do silly voices. Here's my silly voice.